Nafizah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus, live on Radio Al Ansar International.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah for having me, and indeed a pleasure to address your audience on a critical subject which is relevant to each and every one of us.
Now, Nafizah, it has been, sort of a practice, particularly amongst our Muslims, that they very lackadaisical in dealing with estate planning. I'm not saying all, but many Muslims, and they seem to think that, listen, when I get old, I will deal with these issues. But, if you look around us, a lot of youngsters are having various types of illnesses and passing on. And many of them are dying intestate, and there's serious consequences. But a lot of families, they own, many assets, but they fail to realize the importance of estate planning. And in terms of Sharia, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam is reported to have said that do not sleep until you have your will in place, until you plan how you're going to pass on your assets to your family should something happen to you, and those that have assets on their name, how to deal with it. So in brief, we have a lot of elderly listeners, both in Durban, Pietermaritzburg, and around, that listen to us, and many of them are widows, some of them are widowers, and some individuals are young as well. And they, obviously, sort of, for some strange reason, it's not high up in the agenda to really ensure that, you do estate planning and have a will in place and adjust that will regularly. So perhaps you just want to briefly highlight to our listeners out there, what is estate planning and why there is a need for estate planning?
Yes, Yunus, indeed a very, 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 very critical issue. And each and every one of us must be conscientized of this, because death is an event that affects each and every single one of us. We don't know the age, but we definitely know that. And I always say death is the surest event in life, but least planned for event in life. And when you asked your question, it reminded me that there was recently, I think close to COVID times, a survey that was done at the master's office, and it was found that a whopping over 70% of deceased estates that were reported intestate, meaning without a will. So that in itself shows you that our communities, our people, don't take this seriously and don't attend to their affairs. Now, on a legacy planning and estate planning issues, firstly, I think many of our listeners are Muslims, indeed, and we need to understand that the South African law administers estates in terms of South African law. We as Muslims, it's simple. It's we have no choice, and it's dealt with via the Quranic injunctions, and there are specified requirements and methods of distribution, or persons that the distribution has to take place to. However, we've got to balance this with the South African law and make sure that our wills become Sharia compliant, because if you don't leave a will according to Sharia law or Islamic law, then it will be dissolved according to the South African law. Apart from the fact that many of these estates have issues related to distribution to family members, deadlock, lack of funds, and a whole range of issues. Also marriage, lots of times. And for the ladies out there, be conscious. The factual position is that many of our husbands have second or even more wives. And that is something that they are allowed to have, but we must also know how to deal with it, so we're not left in a position where we are destitute at the end of the day after the husband passes on. And it comes about from being educating yourself about these issues. Now, you asked about legacy planning or estate planning, and of course, part of this estate planning is the aspect of educating yourself. And then understanding where or what the dynamics of your particular circumstances are. Sometimes there's adopted children, sometimes there's only daughters, and the marriage, the consequence of your marriage is extremely important. So you've got to take all this into account and seek advices and look at how this impacts on you. And many a times I also find that in practice that lots of times, especially females, they are very complacent and they leave everything for their husbands to sort out and resolve. And I'm talking here not only of those who don't have assets, but those who are actually in business too. But the husband is dealing with their financial aspects and they have no idea as to how this must be dealt with on death. Now, that's a responsibility on each person and each soul themselves. And that there's many Quranic ayahs that also refer to this. One has to deal with it themselves. But with estate planning, there are interventions that you could use, tools you can use, things like trusts, powers of attorney, and also adjustments with regards to like donations, with regards to taxes, etc., such that when you've planned your estate, using an expert, not only a financial advisor, but also somebody like an attorney, an expert attorney who helps you with fiduciary matters, who can help to reduce your taxes, reduce the burdens on your estate, because winding up of estates is extremely, extremely expensive. Having said that, many a times wives believe that they don't have any assets, but they don't take into account that once the husband passes on, they are most likely entitled to inherit. And then sometimes very shortly after that, the wife passes on and she's now got an estate through her husband, but she might not have made a will. So I think my message here on this point is critical, that from the age of 16, even encourage your children to make a will and to ensure that something is put in place which can be reviewed from time to time as the dynamics of your life evolve or change.
Thanks, Nafizah, for giving a bit of a summary of what estate planning is all about. Now, I recollect back in the days when I did commercial law and also a course called Administration of Estates, that there is a threshold for reporting to the master an estate. Otherwise, in terms of a particular section, you don't have to go through the process. Is that threshold still applicable? For example, if your assets are worth just one property that's under maybe 300-400, I'm not sure what the figure is, then there's a shortened process of winding up. Like when we were selling properties back in the days in Phoenix and Chatsworth, and we went about the program of creating sectional title transfers, we reminded those beneficiaries then that, listen, if you have no more assets other than this property, then bear in mind that you must ensure that there is a kind of a will that's created, but there's no onerous process of transfer. Perhaps you want to elaborate on that before we come to the real issue of why the need of a will, because this is a Wills Week and there's an encouragement at the national level for people to be mindful of having wills at all times.
Yes, so the winding up process in South Africa is governed by the Administration of Estates Act. And in terms of that act, it's Section 18.3, which stipulates that if your estate is worth less than 250,000 rands or less, then you are not obliged, or your executor will not be obliged to run the whole process of a winding up of an estate, because estates, there's quite a few processes and quite a few steps to get it to final winding up, and there's quite a few onerous regulations and provisions under which the executor is scrutinized by the master of the High Court. So if it's a Section 18.3 appointment, where I said it's under 250,000 rands, then the burden is less on the executor. And so, in fact, the executor or the person administering the estate is called a representative, not even an executor, which means that you don't have to go the full length of what is expected or the procedure that is expected of a of a normal estate. However, what is still critical, and for the listeners to understand, is that one still must have a will. Otherwise, it creates problems with intestacy, which intestacy means that you die without a will. And there's complications with regards to who will be your heirs if you haven't nominated your heirs. Who will be your executive? Because obviously you haven't nominated an executive. There is no will. How will this distribution take place? What will happen to minors? And nowadays, it's very common to find younger people passing on. Some are even in their 30s, leaving young children behind. Their assets then get controlled by the Guardian's Fund under the Master's Office. And that might not necessarily be expedient because your funds of minors are stuck there. Whereas if you made a will, you can cater for these types of issues.
Now, just to close up the issue of estate planning, which you highlighted, the simple process of establishing or preparing, your estate planning documents is to work out the assets you have and the liabilities, and how do you decide to liquidate or deal with the assets upon your demise, and that will result in some considerations, as you mentioned, of the tax implications, estates duty tax, etc., and the need to consider whether it's appropriate to have a trust so that not everything comes into your estate. For example, the threshold may be tax or estate duty exemption, maybe 2.5 or 3 million. You can unpack that a little bit later. But when you do the estate planning, you have to ascertain your assets and be mindful of the tax implications and whether there's a need to form a trust. And this is why there's a need to meet with a professional, starting off with the attorney who's au fait with the whole processes. Because in drawing up a will, which we'll cover shortly, the will indicate, who are the beneficiaries. And in terms of Sharia law, a Muslim attorney, or maybe even a non-Muslim, would be able to tell you how to go about that will. But before that, people who have assets and liabilities, how do they simply go about ascertaining that when I'm planning my estate, what do I take into account when meeting the attorney? Because if you've got an asset or a house worth 3 million and you've got a bank balance of over 2 million and you've got shares of another million, then obviously you're well over the threshold of exemption of estate duty. So just briefly, what consideration you keep in mind when, unpacking your estate for planning purposes?
Okay, so I want to answer this question in a different manner and first highlight to the listeners that in fact a huge challenge with many estates is a lack of funds, because the costs involved in winding up an estate are hefty. There's administration costs, which are usually at 3.5% of the value of the estate. Now, you gave an example of a house worth 3 million, or even if it's a house that's worth 1 million. Based on that, what's it, 33,000, 3.5% is what you need to cater for the
35,000.
Yeah, 35,000 rands for the, assuming it's only
winding
that.
up the estate, that's a fee.
So you've got to cater for that. And sometimes these estates, you find that our elders, they build up property estates, and there's no liquid cash in the estate. So that becomes a huge problem, because then there's no money for even the conveyancing cost, apart from the administration costs. There's no tailor-made solution, but in general, the principles would be one has to look at how you could have liquid or cash flow in your asset portfolio to ensure that your heirs are not having any difficulty. Otherwise, it means your heirs might have to go to a process of getting a bond to finance the costs. And you've heard, I'm sure many of the listeners have heard over the years, there's estates that are 5 years, 6 years, even some of them even 20 years, and they're not even resolved because of all these types of issues.
And that
apart from
compromises the
disputes.
beneficiaries big time.
Precisely. But the good news is, there are things like policies that can be taken out during your lifetime. But one has to obviously go and see an expert, an attorney, to create these interventions. For example, even the trust is one of the methods, or take out appropriate policies to be able to fund these costs of the estate. Apart from the administration of the estate, you have costs like the estate duty.
What is the threshold for estate duty? How many million?
3.5 million.
So if your asset value is below 3.5 million, you're exempt from estate duty.
Yes, you're exempt from estate duty. However, as I'm saying, the administration costs are high. You'll have conveyancing
costs. So you
costs.
must factor in that.
And the other thing is important is capital gains tax, which also gets quite hefty. Of course, there are some rebates applicable for residential properties where you are living on the property, but there are that. And then, sometimes there might be other costs related to this whole process that might be a little bit beyond the winding up of the estate. For example, if you're getting rental income, then there's it works almost like a letting agency where there's a rental income, so there's a percentage that has to be paid whilst your estate is being wound up. Also, nowadays, with SARS, there might be taxes applicable on your death. You do an e-filing process where you register the estate for tax, and the estate itself is assessed for tax. And without that process, and without having the funds to fund the taxes for SARS, your estate will not be wound up, and you will not get the approvals of the master, and it causes frustrations for the family members. Again, especially where there's minors involved, the difficulty becomes so great for the family members. So it's very critical and important that each and every one must attend to or visit a practitioner, visit an expert, an attorney, to get proper legal advices based on their circumstances.
Now, if you want to obviate the need for having assets on your name, obviously we'll discuss that on another day, the issue of forming a trust and transferring these assets to a trust so that you basically have no assets on your name. So there's no need to have an estate wound up. But very seldom this takes place. More often than not, people have one property and some cash and a vehicle. So there's a need for a will. And you mentioned or alluded to the fact that there's a need for an Islamic will, because when you pass on, you don't want to face the consequences in the qabr, because our listeners are predominantly Muslim. And what is the basic explanation of having a will, Nafizah, so that our listeners are aware of the importance of having a will, both from an Islamic perspective and from a perspective of not delaying a winding up of an estate?
Okay, so with regards to the importance of a will, firstly, as Muslims, and most of us, our listeners would be Muslim, firstly, one needs to or wants to align with the Sharia principles in terms of every aspect of their life. And death is one of your aspects that you got to deal with. And in so doing, although there is much recognition for Islamic law in South Africa, the winding up processes, the succession rules do not comply with Islamic law principles. And we know 1/3 of the estate is what you have freedom of testation over. The balance is by Quranic injunction. Generally, the principle is 1/8 to a wife, where there's a husband, it's 25% to the husband, and balance is by 2 shares to boys and 1 share to females. So in order to get recognition or to recognize that, one has to make sure that this is encapsulated or captured in your will correctly, and the drafting is important. It has to be done properly for the master to acknowledge and accept that will. The other dynamic around this whole thing is to ensure that you go to a will. Lots of times people go and just make their own little hand note, but there are certain regulations which are important to work out whether this is a valid will. Otherwise, it creates lots of disputes and disharmony. And some of these, if I can just refer to, is like it has to be witnessed. It has to be witnessed by 2 competent witnesses. It has to be in writing, your will. So if you just said something to somebody in South African law, that won't necessarily be regarded as valid. And in order to prove that, one would have to make court applications, etc., which burdens your estate even further, and the greater time delays. So from there alone, you can see the complexities involved, and that is the reason it's important to actually sit down with your attorney and express what you want to put down in your will and record those, and make sure that your will is a valid will, and your attorney will make sure if it's signed correctly in front of him or her, then obviously your attorney will take care to make sure that your will gets accepted by the master.
Okay, thank you, Nafizah. I think you've given us a nice synopsis of estate planning and the need for having a will. We'll pick up later on in the program on 1 to other key issues. And I'm sure there'll be a need for more programs in this regard. But we do have other issues we need to discuss. What we do is we'll take a short break. But I want to bring Nafizah in. Nafizah has been sitting patiently listening to the political sentiments and economic outlook. Just to sum up on your side, Nafizah, you mentioned, before I pulled you off and went to the other guys, was the need to ensure that everybody, depending on what the value of your assets are, and even if your assets are not of high value, there's a need to have a will, because if you don't have a will, intestate kicks in and you could violate Sharia. And at the same time, you could also compromise your beneficiaries in terms of they're running their affairs, because you mentioned a lot of women folk that are widows have not been involved in the economic activities of the household. And suddenly, when the male suddenly passes on, they don't know which way to turn, how to pay for the electricity and water. These stop orders are all stopped, etc. So what's your advice to people facing these issues well before something happens, that they must make sure that they do the brief estate planning, they prepare the will, but don't be afraid of going to a competent professional to get the advice and ensure that you're ready, in all aspects. Perhaps your concluding comments, Nafizah.
Jazakallah, Yunus. Yeah, it's very, very welcoming to hear the positive comments from the parliamentary member in our studio, talking of positive delivery. Positive delivery of government manifestations, and also equally welcoming to hear of the positivity from the economist in our studio. However, as individuals, I think it's very, very important to prioritize estate planning and and plan it wisely and protect your hard and earned assets. And just a few guidelines in doing this is, sit with the family, create comprehensive budgets for tracking expenses and taking into account inflation and things like the economist spoke of regarding the increase in unexpected increases in lights and water, etc. Then you've got to look at debt management plans. You've got to look at savings and investments so that you can create an emergency fund for on the death of your breadwinner, as well as during these difficult periods of time. So, estate planning is not something that kicks in only on the date of death, or deals with aspects after death, but also pre-death. So, I like to call it legacy planning, because it's you planning for a lifelong scenario, not just for after death. The other point I'd like to mention is perhaps what is important also is to consider insurances and risk management policies and things like that. All this with your professional for tax efficient savings and retirement planning, and regular reviews and updates of your wills. Um, Most importantly, I think continuously educate yourself on updating yourself on, what's the new, what's current, what's happening, what's how you can adjust your plans. Because lots of people think you do a will once off and it's done, it's over. But change of circumstances require updating, and it's becoming more prevalent nowadays, with the change being now a constant. And finally, I'd like to impress upon the listeners that they must seek appropriate industry advices from appropriate professionals, such as financial planners, as well as attorneys. I do have, as you mentioned earlier, a support group called WADE, which stands for Wills and Deceased Estates. And I'm happy for the radio station to share that information where they can get onto the support group and then, seek advices through that as well.
Important information and advices by Nafizah Kedwa, the attorney who's quite au fait with estate planning and wills. She just gave us a summary of what's required. There's more information we need to unpack in future interviews with Nafizah. We certainly will invite her in the studio to unpack the different types of successions, intestate and others, and from an Islamic perspective, why it is important to take into account every investment and asset, and the need to form trusts and how the tax savings impact on those issues. So we will unpack that, Nafizah, in future programs, because what you did is, because of this being the World's Week, the need to ensure you have a will and don't take it lightly, because when something happens, then, a will is not in place. It creates all kinds of problems. Kesam, I want to bring you in. We